Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our RiverWatch Fall Speaker Series. For those of you who are new to the Illinois RiverWatch Network, RiverWatch is a citizen science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. The mission of RiverWatch is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Now, before we get started, I would like to ask you to keep your microphone muted during the presentation to help limit distractions. And if you have a question along the way, you can either put it in the chat box and then Jason can answer those at the end, or else you can save the question and ask it out loud during the Q&A session at the end of this, the lecture. And with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Jason Knouft. He's a professor of biology at St. Louis University. Jason and members of his lab focus on how changes in land use and global climate are impacting freshwater ecosystems, as well as doing work on watershed hydrology, freshwater conservation, and modeling of species distributions. As a former member of the Knouft lab myself, I am very pleased that he's here tonight to tell us about some of his recent work. Jason, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Danielle. And I'm really pleased to be here as well. I appreciate the invitation. And I really appreciate everybody taking the time tonight to come listen to some of the things that we've been doing in my lab and some of the ways that we think about the sustainability of our freshwater ecosystems and how we can manage that sustainability in the context of a changing climate. So as Danielle mentioned, tonight I'm going to talk about what is the very important role of streamside vegetation in a changing climate. And so just to give you a little bit of background about me and how I think about things and where I'm coming from. So I really like fish. So that is, and I like fishing. And that's why I do what I do. And that's why I got into science, into research. So at the end of the day, I just really want to know where fish are and why they're there. And so that really guides a lot of my research. And so I've got a slide up here showing you just like a small amount of the diversity of fishes that we see in North America. You know, I think a lot of times people, talk about tropical fish and you go to the aquarium and you mostly see fish from like the Amazon or coral reefs. But if you really take a moment to look at the diversity of North American freshwater fishes, I mean, it's just spectacular. I mean, it's just a beautiful array of fish with a diversity of life histories, and they're all out there kind of doing their own thing in our rivers and streams. And so that's my goal, is I want to know why they're out there and where they are. And so if we think about that now, or when I think about that now, if we're thinking about where these fish are, the main things that most aquatic ecologists will consider is flow regimes, that is how much water is coming through a river, the variability of those flows. So like when do we have floods, when do we have low flows, water temperature is really important. And then of course, water quality. So, in the Midwest in particular, nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus have a significant impact on our rivers and streams. And then other contaminants that may, wash off the landscape. And then finally, we like to think a lot about sediment too, and that's sort of the natural part of the ecosystem, but human activities are also increasing the amount of sediment that we see in our rivers and streams, which can impact biodiversity. So as I think about these things now, I mean, we're forced to also consider where fish are and where freshwater species are in the context of ongoing changes in climate. And so, certainly we want to know where the fish are now, what ecosystems are like now, but we also want to be able to understand how changes in climate are going to influence the distribution and diversity of our freshwater systems. And so it's important, to somebody who likes fish, because I don't want to see, fish disappear, but at the same time, there are huge economic importance to our freshwater systems. They're socially very important, and recreationally, obviously, they're very important. So these freshwater systems are really tightly interwoven with the fabric of our society. And so, to maintain life sort of as we know it and enjoy it, we really need to understand and sustain our freshwater systems. And so when we think about changes in climate, I think that the first thing that jumps to people's minds are increases in air temperature. And so these increases have been going on for at least a couple of decades and are, based on greenhouse gas emissions, are projected to continue. And the map here just shows projected increases based on different climate change scenarios. So the map on the left shows a more moderate increase in greenhouse gases, and you can see that, the darker the color, the darker the orange, the greater the increase in temperature. So we see greater increases in temperature near the poles. In this right map, we've got a really dramatic change in temperature, which is sort of based on our current trajectory. And so what you can see is across the globe, we're seeing increases in temperature by the end of the century of, from between 5 and 10 or 11 degrees Celsius, which is dramatic. But the other thing that's really important to consider are changes in precipitation. And so they go hand in hand with changes in air temperature. And so precipitation is certainly important for our freshwater systems because, this is where our rivers and streams and lakes are getting a large part of their water. And it also influences how quickly water cycles through these systems. And so again, we've got two different scenarios here about how precipitation is projected to change. And the patterns aren't quite as consistent as we see with air temperature, but what we're noticing is that sort of mid and upper latitudes we're expected to get greater amounts of precipitation in the future. And then down near the equator in the tropics, we're expected to see decreases in precipitation. The thing that doesn't really come across in these maps, though, is that even like Missouri, for example, a lot of climate projections predict that our annual precipitation is going to change or stay about the same, but seasonally it's going to change dramatically. So our springs are going to get a lot wetter and our summers are going to get a lot drier. So it balances out at the end of the year, but the problem is we're going to see more spring flooding and more droughts during the summer. And so all of these, these temperature and precipitation issues come together to regulate how much water is in our rivers. And these are the things that we need to think about. And so for tonight, the questions I want to address is how do changes in climate affect the amount and quality of water in our rivers and streams? So we're thinking about water quantity and water quality. How do these changes in climate affect water temperature in our rivers and streams? So water temperature is important because the species that live in our rivers and streams are adapted to certain thermal regimes. And if it gets too warm, it can, for example, cause fish kills. But at the same time, as water temperature increases, it can promote outbreaks of algae. It can promote bacterial outbreaks. So there are really social, health issues associated with these increases in temperature that we need to understand. And then finally, I want to get to the title of the talk and use this to, well, first, try and understand if we can add vegetation to river and stream edges to mitigate the impacts of climate change. But more generally, how do we think about adapting to these new climate regimes? And are there ways that we can buffer the landscape to help our rivers and streams and freshwater ecosystems cope with these directional changes in climate? And so these are some of the things I want to talk about tonight. So the first thing I just want to go over with you so you have a bit of an understanding of how the water gets to our rivers and how I think about these systems. I want to show you this slide about the local hydrologic cycle. And so the hydrologic cycle is just how water moves through the Earth's system, right? So from the atmosphere to, to precipitation, down to the land surface, into our rivers, and then back up. So we end up, you see rainfall happening. That rainfall hits the land. Some of it percolates down into the groundwater. You've got some flowing through the soil. Some is intercepted by plants. Some of that water evaporates. And ultimately, what doesn't evaporate or get held up in the soil or groundwater ends up in our rivers. And so this is the primary, or one of the primary controls on our flow regimes, or how much water is in the rivers and streams and how quickly it moves through the rivers and streams. However, because of human activity, we've got a lot of changes driving these hydrologic processes. So probably the two most important are land use transformations. So we change forested or vegetated land cover to urban areas or agricultural areas, and climate change. And so the problem then is that we alter the hydrologic cycle. And so, and that results in a change in the hydrologic response. And so instead of the precipitation falling onto the landscape and really working its way through the soil and plants, it hits the landscape, which has got a lot of concrete on it, for example, and it quickly rushes into our rivers and streams, resulting in flooding and very low flows. And along the way, it pulls sediment and any sort of contaminants off the land surface as it goes. So what we're doing by changing the climate, intensifying precipitation, and basically laying down concrete and impervious surfaces is that we're speeding up the hydrologic cycle. And we're speeding up the way water flows through the Earth's systems. And that's why we see floods in the spring, because we've got these intense rain events. The water quickly rushes off the landscape into our rivers and streams. Water goes up really fast, floods, and then it comes down quickly. So a lot of the flooding we're seeing is expected to intensify largely because of a combination of these factors. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with climate change in freshwater systems? Well, one, we can stop emitting greenhouse gases. And this is the primary way that we're going to address this issue and the most long-term sustainable goal. But we certainly know that climate change is ongoing, and we can look back 20 years and see the trends in our rivers reflecting these changes in climate. So in conjunction with limiting our emission of greenhouse gases, I shouldn't say stop emitting greenhouse gases, I should say limit our emission of greenhouse gases. But anyway, we also want to try and increase the resilience of our freshwater ecosystems through climate adaptation approaches. And so what do I mean by climate adaptation? And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines climate adaptation as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. And so what that means is we recognize the climate's changing, and we want to do whatever we can to minimize the impacts of those expected changes. And so one of the ways we can do that is with ecosystem-based adaptation. And basically what that means is that these adaptation efforts utilize biodiversity and natural ecosystem services to minimize the impacts of these changes in climate. And this can be in freshwater systems, terrestrial systems. The idea of climate adaptation is broad and not solely applicable to freshwater systems. So when we think about climate adaptations for rivers and streams, what people generally, the goal is generally to maintain natural flow regimes, meaning, we want to minimize these intense flooding events, keep the water level at sort of what it's expected to be based on historical patterns. We want to minimize temperature fluctuations, that is, we don't want to see really extreme heat events. And we also want to limit the amount of sediment and contaminants that enter our rivers. And so one of the primary ways we can do this, and one of the probably most tractable way we can do this, is by adding riparian buffers. And so what's a riparian buffer? The riparian zone refers to the area just adjacent to a river or a stream. So basically like the area right next to the riverbank. And when people talk about riparian buffers, what we mean are essentially sections of vegetation that are put next to the rivers to minimize the impacts of landscape factors on what's going on in the river. And so by this, what I mean is, we've got these changes driving our hydrologic processes. What we need to do is move our land use our urbanization back a little and put some trees in there. And I mean, this is an oversimplification, but it's the basic idea. And what then happens is that as the rain hits the landscape and starts rushing towards the river, these riparian zones slow the water down. And by slowing the water down, it also limits the amount of sediment and contaminants that get into the river. And it really minimizes the intensity of flooding events. And at the same time, it also limits the number of really low flow events or droughts, because the water basically gets held up in the soil around the roots of the trees or other vegetation and slowly seeps into the river. So it's a more gradual addition of water to our riverine systems. And so just to give you a visual of what this looks like, on the left, we've got an example of a good riparian zone, and on the right, an example where we don't see much riparian vegetation. And the benefit is that the river channel stays deeper. It's more of a natural, there's more of a natural sinuosity to the river channel. And also the thing that I didn't bring up yet is that these trees provide a lot of shading to the river. And so they cool the river, they keep it cool. So I think, living in Missouri, we can all, relate to, walking around in an open field or in a parking lot or something like that. During the summer, it's really hot. And then all of a sudden you walk into a forest or an area with a lot of trees and it immediately cools down a few degrees, maybe even more. And so, I mean, not only are the trees and riparian vegetation stabilizing flows, but they're also decreasing water temperature, as opposed to what we see on the right side. And so when we think about adding riparian vegetation, what we're trying to do is buffer against intense climate events so that our flow regimes are more natural, the amount of sediment washing into the rivers is minimized, the amount of contaminants and nutrients washing into the river is minimized, and water temperature is also stabilized. And so all of these things, by doing all of these things, we sort of keep the riverine ecosystem in its sweet spot effectively. So where all the organisms are adapted and can do really well, and we have a healthy ecosystem. So what we don't know too much about, though, actually, is how adding these riparian buffers will help us in terms of climate change, because we can't go out and measure the impacts of changes in climate 20 years from now, because we're not there yet. And so what we have to do is use modeling approaches. And so we create mathematical models that project what river flows and water temperatures are going to look like in 20, 30, 50 years based on what we know about these conditions now. And so work in my lab focuses on the Merrimack River watershed, which I'm sure many of you know is in the eastern part of Missouri, south of St. Louis, and it's just beautiful. It's there are three main tributaries: the main branch of the Merrimack, the Burbus, and the Big River. The watershed supplies drinking water to maybe 250,000 people. There's certainly economic and recreational importance. And there's a variety of land use, but it's also biologically incredibly diverse. So the statistic I always like to throw out there is that we have more species of minnows in the Merrimack River than anywhere else in the world. And in terms of North America, minnows are the most diverse family of fishes. So we've got the most minnows of the most diverse family of fishes in North America in the Merrimack. So it's definitely a special place. And so we've been working with the Nature Conservancy in the Merrimack, and their goal is to understand how best management practices, or really climate adaptation practices, will impact water quantity and water quality. And will these management practices be sustained as climate changes, and how will biodiversity be impacted? So if you're with the Nature Conservancy or any sort of conservation organization, I mean, certainly you're putting resources into conserving land right now, and you're trying to manage the land in a way that it sustains the ecosystem. But what they really want to understand is, are the management activities they're applying now going to hold for the next 30 or 40 years as climate changes? And that's one of the things that we were working with them on. And so, as I mentioned, we have to use these mathematical models or these hydrologic models to predict what stream flows and sediment and contaminants are going to look like in the watershed, both now and then like 50 years from now or 100 years from now. So I'm not going to get too much into details about the hydrologic model, but I'm going to show you a few things about essentially how it works. And the model we use is called the Soil Water Assessment Tool, and or SWAT. And the way SWAT works is, here's the Merrimack watershed, and it breaks the watershed up into what are referred to as subbasins. And we've broken it up into 470 subbasins. And within each subbasin, there's a single stream section, right? So a subbasin relates to a single section of stream across the watershed. And what the model does then is it estimates stream flow and sediment in each subbasin, and we look at it on a monthly time step. So the way we run our model is that we go from the year 1970 up to 2099. And for all of those, whatever, 130 years, in every month of every one of those years, we've got an estimate of stream flow and how much sediment is getting into the river in each section of stream throughout the entire watershed. And so when we get into the future, we can start thinking about how changes in climate are going to impact these conditions. And so just to give you an idea of what that looks like, so here's the Merrimack watershed. And I'm going to start pulling away parts of this map so you can understand what our hydrologic model outputs look like. So first thing, I'll take away just the base map. And so you can see the blue lines are the river lines, and each one of these black sort of polygons are the subbasins. So maybe take a look over here on the eastern side of the watershed where my pointer is moving. You can see that sub-watershed contains a single stream section. And so we know from 1970 to 2099, or not know, but we have an estimate of what stream flow looks like every month in that stream section as every other part of the watershed. And so this is what our stream flow, or we refer to it as discharge estimates, look like. And so the darker the color of the subbasin, the more water is in that stream section. And so the dark areas are the main channels of the Burbus, the Merrimack, and the Big River. And these lighter areas are all the smaller streams across the watershed. So we can measure discharge, and just to give you an idea of what this looks like, we compare what our model predicts to several stream gauges that are placed by the USGS throughout the watershed. And so look at this top graph in Eureka, there is a stream gauge. And the blue lines on this graph, well, the x-axis is date and the y-axis is discharge, which is the amount of water moving through the stream section. So the red lines are what we simulate, and the blue lines are what's actually observed at the USGS stream gauge. So we actually do a really good job of predicting stream flow. But we can also estimate the amount of sediment coming through each stream section. And so here are your sub-watersheds again, and each one of the sub-watersheds, the darker the brown or tan, the more sediment gets washed off the landscape into that river. So in the southwestern part of the watershed, there's a lot of grazing, there's a lot of agriculture. You get down to these urban areas, you get a lot of runoff. And so what you're seeing there is ecosystems that are probably fairly degraded because they're getting these excess pulses of sediment throughout the year. And so again, this is just how our model does estimating sediment. And so the blue line is what's observed, and the red line is what we simulate. And so we've got stream flow data, we've got sediment data, and then working with the Nature Conservancy, what we did was identified what we're referring to as conservation action areas throughout the Merrimack watershed. And so the pink and green and blue areas are areas that are already under some sort of conservation. But what the Nature Conservancy wanted to know was, where are the other places that are important? Where are the places that are not being conserved, where the habitat is actually fairly degraded, but there are a lot of important species? And so we went through with them and did that, and we came up with 16 sub-watersheds across the entire watershed that we felt were biodiversity hotspots, but also could use a little help in terms of managing the amount of sediment and nutrients getting into the river. And these are just a list of them. And what I want you to note here, so you've got the stream name, the county that it's located in, and then you've got these sub-basin numbers. And so the sub-basin number is just how we number them across the watershed, but they're going to be important in the next couple of graphs. So what we wanted to do then is we don't have the time or money to go out and plant riparian buffers in all of these 16 sub-watersheds. And so what we did was we took our hydrologic and sediment model, which includes land cover in it, and we virtually added riparian buffers to all of those sub-watersheds. So we went into our computer model and we basically added trees in 100 meters along the banks of all these rivers, okay? And then we ran the model again. And so what that does is it tells us how much sediment is getting into the watershed in its current state and what the sediment and nutrient reductions are going to look like if we were to plant trees along the banks of the river, okay? And so that's what we did. And to give you an idea of what these results look like, so here are each of our sub-basins in this first column. So those are the numbers. And what I want you to note is when we add 100 meters of a riparian buffer along each side of the stream and river, the amount of sediment almost always decreases. The amount of nitrogen getting into the watershed almost always decreases. The amount of phosphorus getting in almost always decreases. And in some cases, it's sort of a minor decrease, and in some cases, it's a really dramatic decrease in sediment, for example. And this has to do with sort of the characteristics of the landscape and how much riparian buffer is already there. But this allows the Nature Conservancy to really target areas they think are important and worthy of action. So, but then what happens is climate changes. So, you know, we can add these riparian buffers, but are they really going to hold up to these intense precipitation events that we're seeing in the future? And also these changes in flows. And so, you know, based on our models, on the x-axis here, you've got the month, and on the y-axis is discharge, and this is at the outlet of the Merrimack. So the blue bars are the discharge from 1990 to 1999. So it's something that's already happened. The red bars are from 2050 to 2059. So this is based on a climate change prediction. And so what you can see is that in the spring, you know, we're seeing, like, for example, in May, more precipitation is projected. But then the real noteworthy thing is from in May, a decrease in stream flow starts. And so from the summer all the way into the fall through September, we see a dramatic decrease in flows. And so that's going to be an impact. But then what we want to think about is the amount of sediment that's getting into the stream. And so this is a little bit of a busy graph, but I'm going to take you through it. And so on the x-axis, you see these conservation action subbasins. So these are our 16 subbasins where we virtually added the riparian buffer. And the y-axis is the amount of sediment getting into that stream section every year based on our models. And so the red bars are our sediment estimates from 1990 to 1999. The purple bars are the sediment inputs from 1990 to 1999 when we virtually add that riparian buffer. So if you look across, in basically almost all cases, the amount of sediment decreases. right, when we add the buffer. So you can see the decrease here. Here, there's a really dramatic decrease. There's a dramatic decrease here. Stays about the same out here. Then the green bars, the light green bars, are from 2050 to 2059. And this is the amount of sediment that would get into the stream section if we didn't add a buffer right now. And so if we left the riparian zone the way it is, based on the intense precipitation events we're going to be seeing in the future, in this subwatershed, for example, so you want to compare the red to the green, I mean, what we're seeing about 4 times the amount of sediment getting into that stream section based solely on changes in climate. And so this kind of aqua color here is 2050 to 2059 when we add the 100-meter buffer now. And so what you can see is that the amount of sediment getting into the stream decreases, but it's still not what it is right now. So even with these climate adaptation strategies, we see several cases where it just doesn't seem to make that much difference. We're seeing a huge increase in the amount of sediment getting into the streams based on climate. And it doesn't make a difference if we put a riparian buffer in or not. However, there are some positive cases. And so if you look at subbasins 51, 66, 75, and 93, the addition of riparian buffers almost basically in some cases cuts in half the amount of sediment that's getting into the watershed in the future if we didn't have the buffer. And in the case of like subbasin 75, this aqua bar, which is in the future with a riparian zone, is almost the same as what we see now without a riparian zone. So the idea is that riparian buffers can serve as a climate adaptation strategy, but not everywhere. And it's likely going to require a combination of different strategies to really achieve significant goals in terms of the conservation of our ecosystems. And this is important because we went out and we wanted to check and see, well, what are the fish responding to? Like, that's the important thing when we're talking about biodiversity, is like what parts of these variables are actually important to the fish. And so we went out and we sampled 13 different sites and we collected 43 species of fishes and over 6,700 individuals. And we just related these measures of fish diversity to our environmental characteristics, so stream flow and sediment and nutrients. And so what we found is, I'm just going to give you very general ideas, is that the total abundance of individuals in a stream, it doesn't make a difference what kind of fish they are, is associated with temperature, and it's positively associated. So the warmer it is, the more individuals you've got. And so you're thinking climate change, well, maybe that's not so bad. It'll get warmer, we'll have more fish out there. However, species diversity is negatively associated with increases in temperature. So that means as temperature goes up, species diversity goes down. And so when you consider that with abundance, basically what that means is we're going to have fewer species in the stream as temperature increases, but there's just going to be a ton of 1 or 2 kinds of species, right? So maybe we'll have like a ton of catfish, or we'll have a ton of creek chubs, but we won't have very much else, but the numbers will stay about the same. Species diversity is negatively correlated with sediment, so we can expect that as climate changes and sediment increases, that's going to have a negative impact on species diversity. And then total species richness is correlated with stream flow. We can look at individual families. So suckers, which are a group of fishes that live on the bottom, are associated with temperature and sediment. Bass and sunfish are associated with changes in discharge, and minnows are associated with changes in sediment. And so I just show you these different groupings of fishes and these different measures of species diversity, just to point out that these variables we're trying to understand, so flow, sediment, water temperature, these are all important and all things that we need to consider when we're trying to deal with climate adaptation. So I've talked a lot about stream flow and sediment and how climate change is going to influence those processes, but what about water temperature? And can we do anything with the riparian zone to minimize how much increases in air temperature are going to impact increases in water temperature. So I want to take you away from the Midwest and go up to the northeastern US just to give you an idea of what these water temperature changes look like. So again, this is the SWOT modeling approach. And these are just a groups of the important species on the eastern seaboard. But the different colors represent annual temperatures from 1970 to 1999 in this region. And so the green areas are where it's cooler, and the orange and red areas are where the water temperatures are warmer. And so we can take the same kind of approach that we did with sediment and stream flow and look at future temperatures. And so what you can see, if you just sort of visually assess the increases in orange and red, is that the streams are increasing, or the river water temperatures are increasing. And this is really important because fish are adapted to temperature. They're ectotherms, and increases in temperature can push them to their physiological limit and cause things like fish kill or poor performance. And so this map here is just looking at the difference between current water temperature and future water temperature. And so, you know, in the south, that's the green area is the Chesapeake Bay watershed. You know, you move up into the Delaware and the Hudson. And so water temperature increases are increasing with latitude. But what I really want you to take from this is that it's different everywhere, right? If you get up into New England, it's really patchy. Some subwatersheds have dramatic increases in water temperature, and others are not that dramatic. And so what that tells us is water temperature is really a local issue. And what's going on locally with the landscape is likely what's influencing water temperature responses to increases in air temperature. And so then we need to manage these issues and adapt to climate change at a local scale. And the nice thing about riparian vegetation is that it provides shading, and we know it can cool water temperatures, but the question is, how significant is this cooling effect, particularly in the context of, you know, a few degrees increases in air temperature? And so we took a little bit different approach here, and we focused on a single stream in the Merrimack watershed, and that's LaBarque Creek. And so this is one of the most diverse streams in actually all of Missouri. And it's located near Pacific. There's at least 44 species in the stream. And the stream contains smallmouth bass, which of course are important for recreational purposes, and ecologically they're important. And in 2006, Whitledge et al. Had a publication where they estimated that smallmouth bass will start losing weight when water temperatures exceed 27 degrees Celsius. So basically what happens is their physiology ramps up so much because of the warmer temperatures that they're burning calories that they can't replace, and they start losing weight. So when you get above 27 degrees Celsius, it's bad news for the smallmouth bass. And then the Missouri DNR also set a temperature standard for LaBarque at 32.2 degrees Celsius for conservation purposes. And so what we want to try and understand is just what happens during the warmest times of the year. And so we jumped into this and we decided, you know what, we're going to examine the warmest day in 2018 and try and understand how adding or removing riparian vegetation alters water temperatures. And again, we can't really go out there and start chopping down trees. So what we had to do was, again, use a water temperature model. And so we're not using SWOT here. We're using something called SSTemp, which is a stream segment temperature model. And it calculates water temperature along a segment of stream. And it can be at a very small scale. So we're thinking about like less than 1,000 meters of stream. And it calculates that water temperature based on, you know, the water temperature of the water flowing into the upstream section, the flow volume, how much riparian vegetation shading there is. And it tells us what the maximum water temperatures are for a single day. And so what we did was we took July 13th, 2018, which was the warmest day of 2018, and so LaBarque Creek has a really nice riparian zone, and it's actually, the vegetation density there is about 90%. So the riparian zone there is in great shape. And using that SSTemp model, we estimated the average daily water temperature in the stream that day was 25.7 degrees Celsius. So it's below, even on the hottest day of the year, it's below that mass loss thermal cutoff of 27 degrees Celsius. But then what we did is we virtually went in and we chopped down trees. So we decreased the vegetation density down to 50%. And so it looks more like kind of these suburban areas. So the forest is thinned out. And what happens when you reduce the amount of shading is that the water temperature actually increases to 27.4 degrees Celsius. And then if you were to go in and be even more dramatic about it and went to kind of this fully urbanized area where you might only have 10% vegetation density, then the average daily water temperature would have gone up to 29.5 degrees Celsius. And so what does this mean? Basically, on this graph, we've got our smallmouth bass. We've got this red dotted line, which is that thermal limit where if we go above 27 degrees Celsius, we are going to start, the bass are going to start losing weight. Anything below this, they're in good shape. So with 90% shading, or 90% shading, so good riparian zone, the water temperature remains below that 27 degrees threshold. If we cut that by even down to 50%, the water temperature on the warmest day increases above that critical line. And if we go to 10% shading, then we get up, far above what the bass should be able to tolerate in terms of its normal physiological functioning. So over here on the y-axis, to put it in Fahrenheit, if that makes it a little bit easier to understand, is about 80 degrees is where the water temperature becomes critically excessive. And with that 10% shading, we're about 5 degrees Fahrenheit above what the bass can tolerate. So essentially what this is telling us is that with an increase of by maintaining a significant riparian zone or adapting to changes in climate by adding riparian zones, we can actually buffer the stream water temperature by over 6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is significant. And so if we think about the temperature increase projected with climate change, what that tells us is that by adding riparian vegetation, it's possible that we may be able to almost fully buffer these streams against the changes in climate that are projected in the coming decades. So just to wrap things up, changes in climate are going to continue to have significant impacts on our hydrologic cycle, water availability, water quality, and thermal characteristics are included in water quality. So, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need viable climate adaptation strategies to sort of carry us through these critical stages until we have a handle on greenhouse gas emissions. And so robust riparian vegetations offer the opportunity to minimize or limit the effects of changes in climate. They buffer against impacts on stream flow, sediment, and water temperature. But we need to be realistic and recognize that this is not the final solution for these freshwater systems, is that adding riparian vegetation and managing riparian zones is probably going to have to be used in combination with a variety of other strategies. And so with that, I'd just like to thank people that worked together on this project. Steve Harrington and Barbara Cherry are with the Nature Conservancy, and Lynn Schrader with the Missouri Department of Conservation are critical to this work. And there were several postdocs and graduate students at SLU who worked on this. And there was an undergraduate student, Alex Vaughn, who is supported by the NGREX Summer Undergraduate Fellowship Program and did a good chunk of the work on the stream temperature models. And so I really appreciate that. And so with that, I'll wrap it up and I guess open it up to any questions, and thank everyone again for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. That was a great presentation. We do have some questions already in the chat box, so I'll go ahead and just start reading those off.
Okay.
First, from Maureen, does it matter what type of plants are in the riparian buffer?
Yes, yes, it does. And we don't, we don't have a great handle on what that is. So what we do know is that most plants are effective. And so any kind of riparian vegetation you would plant would likely be better than just, say, like a parking lot or an agricultural field. But even a grass lawn is better than nothing. Next step up would be, like shrubbery or bushes. But then if you can get like, forested situation with, some older trees that really stabilize the bank with their roots, that's, that's, really optimal as well. But the thing that's nice about putting the trees in is that they add that shading. And so if you're looking for both, improving water quality and limiting floods, and then also minimizing increases in water temperature, then something that has a big canopy over the stream is important.
Okay. And then Mike says that he's noticed a lot of trees along waterways ending up in the water because of erosion. How far away from the stream bank should trees be planted? The trees that end up in the water disrupt the flow and can cause erosion in different locations. It can be a complete mess.
Yeah, Mike, this is a great point. And it just depends. It's really a place-based situation. So, adding a tree, three, right on the bank in one stream might be appropriate, but in another stream, because of the way the river bends or the type of soil that you've got, it may not be appropriate. And so this is the idea of planning these buffers is, it's a complicated engineering endeavor, and the field is constantly evolving. So what, like 20 years ago, we used to think would be a good way to stabilize a bank, we're realizing now results in the kind of situation that you're talking about. So there's no one size fits all answer to your question. It really depends on a whole variety of factors associated with the stream. But you're totally correct that, if it's done incorrectly, it can actually be more harmful, because the whole tree will fall in and pull the bank in with it, and then divert the stream to start eating away another part of the bank. So yeah, you really need to be thoughtful with how these riparian zones are added.
Okay, Kevin asks, could you give an example of specific species of trees and shrubby plants to plant to form a riparian buffer? Could you mention the other variety of strategies to use in conjunction with the riparian buffers?
Sure. To answer your first question, no, I can't. Again, it's dependent on where you are, what type of soil is there, like the slope of the landscape. So it's difficult to say for sure what single, people don't say like, oh, plant an oak tree and that'll solve all your problems. Unfortunately, I can't give you a single answer to that question. And so then in terms of other strategies to use in conjunction with riparian buffers, there are a couple of different things we can think about. Conserving groundwater is a way to, basically not overdrawing from groundwater, because the groundwater is going to influence stream flow volume, which influences water temperature, and the amount of groundwater getting into the stream is obviously going to cool it. When we think about other strategies in terms of sediment, we can think about agriculture. And so, certainly people in the St. Louis region are thinking about, what sustainable agriculture looks like, and thinking about moving from annual crops to perennial crops where, we're not tilling the landscape so frequently, and so not basically turning up the soil. So when it rains, a whole bunch of sediment flows into the streams and rivers. So there's a variety of different ways that we can think about this.
Okay, a question from Allison. Can you comment on the relative roles of annual versus perennial plants in the riparian buffer?
I hopefully just touched on that.
Yeah.
But the perennial plants are going to have deeper roots. They're going to stabilize the soil a lot better. So, you know, when you're putting in and taking out annuals, you're disrupting the soil more frequently, and the soil is not as stabilized because the roots aren't as deep. And so the perennial plants really provide a greater foundation. And also, you know, there's more root mass, and so they're sort of slowing down this hydrologic cycle by holding on to water for longer periods of time.
All right, and right now the last one in the chat box. What do you, from Thomas, what do you think the most effective way to encourage people to restore the riparian buffers would be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Thomas. And so, you know, you would hope that you could say, well, you know, you're going to conserve the resource, and that's important, and we should all, you know, conserve natural systems and that kind of thing. But, you know, everybody has different interests and different needs. And so the way, you know, society doesn't function as a single unit with a single set of interests. Like everybody, you know, we've got farmers out there, we've got, you know, people who, you know, run float trips. We've got people who use rivers to take their kids out on the weekend and they want a clean river. You know, we've got people whose families are in mining, right? And so everybody has a different interest in the river. And so restoring river restoration and sort of endpoint goals are different for everyone. And so the most effective way to encourage people to restore riparian buffers is to make it relevant to their lives and make it relevant to their interests. And again, everybody's different. And so I think generally speaking, that's the best way we can go about it is make it relevant to people and recognize that not everybody thinks about things the same way you do, and not everybody values things the same way that you do. But, you know, we need to meet at some sort of common ground. Oh, Danielle, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't see any other questions. Several people saying thank you and great job, and I will, so I'll echo those comments. It was a great presentation. I'm going to go ahead, and if I can find the right button, I'm going to try to unmute everyone. I know I supposedly have that ability. Oh, here we go. Unmute all. Okay, so you're all,
I don't know exactly what
you're
it
all
was. Actually,
unmuted
it was
now.
a
So if
training
anybody wants to
session
say,
for some people,
an
but I
applause.
wasn't there to get training. Actually,
Okay,
I was
maybe
there
not.
to observe more or less. And
Okay, so that didn't work how I hoped it would. Well, let's assume that we have some general applause then. Thank you very much, Jason, for your presentation.
Yeah.
I see lots of little applause hands popping up on the screen. So.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone for taking time out of what I'm sure is a busy week for everyone to come and listen. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate Danielle's efforts with the RiverWatch program. Incredibly important. It's incredibly important. So thank you for doing that.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. And we do have, in a couple of weeks on October 26th, we will have another presentation. It will be on 3D printing and the evolutionary ecology of North American riverine snails. Sounds like a very interesting way to integrate nature and technology. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. So hopefully some of you will be able to make it to that. Registration, similar to what you did for this one, you can find us on Facebook, and hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.